English, and then we'll sing the melody together once we have heard Ezra sing it and then look at the words. So Ezra, why don't you introduce the melody for us?
Of course. So I'm 90% sure I have the same melody in mind that Rabbi Michael does. There are a lot of melodies for the Shema, so if I'm thinking of the wrong one, my apologies. But this melody for the Shema goes, Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad. Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad. Baruch Shem Kevod Malchuto Leolam Vaed. Baruch Shem Kevod Malchuto Leolam Vaed. Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad. Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad.
So these 6 words that Ezra was singing, I want to kind of talk about the translation. And in the prayer book, it's often translated, Hear, O Israel, Adonai is our God, Adonai is one. Let me kind of think about this in a more expansive way. We often say that Christians often define their identity by believing in Jesus or not. Jews rarely define their identity on belief. It's more on what they do. Do you light Shabbat candles? Do you celebrate the holidays? Do you keep certain Jewish values? It's much more based on that, what we do, much less based on belief. And some Jews believe, some don't. It's just an interesting mix that we have non-believers and believers sitting side by side in our Jewish communities. That all being said, there's a stereotype that I think is relatively accurate that if you ask Jews, what do you believe in? This is the one sentence that liberal, conservative, traditional Jews will say, this is what we believe in. We do believe this sentence to be true, that there's one God and that there's, that one God idea is the God of Israel, and that's however we conceive of that God idea, that is the liturgical moment that we can affirm that sense of belief, no matter where you are in that spectrum of belief. And we were studying last week about the mystics and this idea of God being this sense of oneness in the entire universe. So here in this sentence about oneness, we can see that the mystics love this teaching and go crazy with it. And so the mystics will truly look at this sentence as a deep invitation into the ideal of oneness. And that this sense of oneness, think of like a Buddhist meditator meditating on the oneness of the universe or nothingness. That oneness that is the universal consciousness is perhaps what this sentence is pointing to. So whether you're thinking about it from the mystical lens or the rational lens, like we looked at my mind last week, and you talked about everything that is not God, the table, the book, the chair, the computer. Once you've named all the things that aren't God for Maimonides, everything else is God, which is a radical idea. It's called negative attributes or a negative theology. But it also points to this oneness concept as well. This oneness concept is typically called monotheism. The specific idea that all is all God is pantheism. We'll come back to that term pantheism in a few minutes. But the reason I'm using this as our introduction now is we're going to be talking about a variety of thinkers, Martin Buber, Abraham Joshua Heschel, Mordechai Kaplan, that will all come with different ideas about what this oneness might mean for them. Okay, so I'm going to invite you now to sing along with Ezra as Ezra sings this one more time. And we will join Ezra as we can. Those of us that are in the room can actually, we have multiple microphones, we can sing along.
Yeah, let's sing one more time. I believe those you might need to mute yourself, Rabbi Michael, so things don't get overwhelming on Zoom. But Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad. 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 Baruch Shem Kevod Malchuto Le'olam Va'ed. Baruch Shem Kevod Malchuto Le'olam Va'ed.
Thank you, Ezra. Now, I want to point out a couple Hebrew things that are going on in that sentence to have a kind of a deeper understanding of that idea. The term we're using, Adonai, is a replacement term for the four-letter Hebrew name Yud He Vav He. These four Hebrew letters, the Yud, the He, the Vav, and the He, create the unpronounceable ancient name of God that if we wanted to put consonants and vowels on, might be Yahweh, might be Jehovah, might be a variation of these, but Jews do not pronounce this unpronounceable name of God because they don't know what the correct pronunciation is. And therefore, when the rabbis 2,000 years ago at the time of Jesus developed the Hebrew prayer liturgy, they also developed this replacement for God's four-letter name, the Tetragrammaton, the Yud He Vav He, with Adonai. This term Adonai means my Lord. So my Lord is like a nice functioning idea as a substitute, but we don't believe in kings anymore. So what does it mean to us? We don't have a clue what my Lord means. And so for some people, my Lord works. For some people, Adonai works. For me, I like it, but it's a challenging term. We're going to look at different ideas about God in a few minutes. We're going to figure out like which metaphors for God's name might work for you. I want to say one more thing about this Tetragrammaton, the Yud He Vav He, and I drew this out on the whiteboard last week. When Hebrew speakers, Hebrew readers look at that four-letter name of God, they don't see a noun, they see a verb. And that rocks our world because so many of our ideas of God are based on God as a noun. That to think of God as a verb, it's almost like bending our brain in half. But when a Hebrew reader or a Hebrew speaker reads this four-letter name of God, they're not looking at an object, a cup, a table, a chair. They're looking at a verbal idea, a process. And so what we can begin to say is that Jewish ideas of God are very creative, very innovative, and very much based on a distinctly different presentation than that of Jesus in human form. Islam will come up with something very similar. Islam, which will be like the after Jesus and the Christians developing this messianic idea, Islam will say, yeah, we're good with that, but we want to go back to this unnameable, unknowable God idea that's beyond time and space. And so they will kind of invite in this ineffable nature of God as well. And so Judaism and Islam, as much as we're very different on, let's say, political ideas, we do have a lot of similarities in some of our theology and some of our prayer. Next week, we're going to be diving deeper into prayer, so we'll kind of have more conversations. The reason we're doing these 2 weeks on God is so that when we get to the prayer book, we can figure out what we might mean when we get to this God question. Okay. All right, so I want to do a quick check-in with you. So in the chat, go ahead and give me in one sentence something that is either new or good for you, or something that may have come up in the readings. So go ahead and put that in the chat, and then I'll circle around with the people that are here. So the group that's here, something new or good, or something that came up in the readings, and we'll start Mason over here. What's on your mind today?
24 today.
24, amazing. Happy birthday.
Yeah, happy birthday.
Terrific.
Happy birthday, happy birthday, happy birthday, happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. That's an original.
Okay, Len, what's new or good, or what's a comment on the readings?
Well, same old, same old. I may be setting up something where I'll be doing some tutoring to students at Notre Dame College for Excel. And I did different readings, so I don't have any comment on your readings. I was reading the stuff you suggested about, three or four different scholars, and it's interesting.
Good, good. We'll get to what's interesting about it. I'm going to invite our two guests to introduce yourselves and say something of why you're joining us today.
Okay, yeah, I can go first. So
Yeah.
my name is Josh. I'm joining you here today because I'm interested in the religion. Something new that I've already learned is that there is and correct me if I'm wrong, there's a 4-letter word to the name of God. Is that right?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, that was something I did not know.
That's great.
I'm Amanda. I'm with him. Sort of not really sure where I stand spiritually, so interested in learning new things. It's funny, I actually know you. You remember me?
Tell me some more.
I used to be your groomer.
Len, we'll come back.
I used to be your groomer.
Oh, you're so familiar.
Parking lot, drill later. Okay. Alex.
Well, nothing's new, which is good.
Okay.
Everything's still chugging right along, so.
Okay. We have also reset the room for the hour. We realized we were setting the room a little bit too wide last time, and we're hoping that this will be a better setup to use our owl. And so far, I think we've got a better comprehension. Ezra, I'm going to ask if you could go through the chats for us real quick.
Of course. So we have some messages in the chat, some check-ins. Erin says the good thing about the past week is that it was pretty relaxing and they weren't too busy, which she needed. Jennifer says that she's gained a better understanding of what perspectives align with her personal views. David says his niece Paulina has gotten engaged. And then there's a question in the chat as well from the readings from Amy. Is this idea of God as a process or verb a concept that would be accepted within Orthodox circles?
Yeah, Amy, we'll dive deeper into that in a few minutes, but primarily no. Process theology, which is done by both Christians and Jews, and to a certain extent, do not get well accepted among Orthodox Jewish theological ideas. And therefore, Mordechai Kaplan, who is kind of the innovator that we'll look at in a few minutes, is actually excommunicated by Orthodox rabbis in New York in 1930 as he's developing these ideas, because they simply don't feel like he's standing within the traditional framework, and they feel threatened by his radical ideas of God. So this concept of process theology is probably tolerated somewhat today, but not well accepted nor thought of as meaningful. I would say, if we're thinking about those three ideas, mystical, rational, or secular, if this process theology is considered a secular idea of God, then Orthodox communities tend to go into the bifurcation between the mystical and the rational. And they kind of leave process theology or secular thought off to the side. Okay, I'm going to now play a game with all of us. So this is a very fun one, and you not need to kind of think about your ideas of God in this game. So we're going to look at about 40 different names of God that are used in the Hebrew Bible or in the Hebrew prayer book, or just in traditional ways. And it's not in the blue book, so we can close up the blue books for now. Ezra's going to share their Google Doc for us, and we'll kind of look at them together. The game we're going to play, let me go with Ezra's sharing the screen. I think that's going to be easier than mine. Let me clear out the chat to make room for you guys to see this better.
It's a little larger on his side too.
Let me kind of make it bigger for you. Not make it too big. No, I think we can do it. Okay. Okay, so I'm going to run through these names of God. And as I'm doing that, I want you to either keep notes or keep a mental checklist of two different ideas. Which ones resonate with you? Which ones don't resonate with you? Then we're going to go into breakout groups, and you're going to chat for 5 minutes about which terms feel like they're most interesting to you and which ones feel like they're not where your God ideas resonate. Okay, so we're just going to start with, this is that 4-letter name of God. These 4 consonants are Yud, He, Vav, He, and so it's represented by the English letters YHVH, and there it's spelled out. But once we begin to do anything more than write the Hebrew term, it loses something. So I like to just say that this is either the ineffable name of God, or Yud, He, Vav, He, or God as the breath of all life. This is this God as the verb to be. In the Hebrew Bible, there is no way to say the present tense is. There's was, there's will be, but there's no is. So perhaps God becomes is, or consciousness, or awareness, or presence, or right. We can kind of play that. So one way to think about this Yud He Vav He name is God as ineffable. The second name is Hashem. This is an Orthodox or traditional name that God is often considered. Hashem is the name. And so that's another way to refer to God when not wanting to use God's specific proper pronoun. Traditional Jews avoid using that proper pronoun to somehow invoke God in names as a way of invoking God's name in vain. So they don't want to invoke God's name accidentally. They want to do it intentionally when they're in prayer or in study. Okay, the third name that I mentioned earlier on was my Lord, Adonai. This is a Hebrew term. The fourth, Adoshem, Adonai, my Lord, and Hashem, the name. It's a combination of Hashem and Adonai. The fifth name, which I am very attracted to, is from the book of Exodus. This is Exodus chapter 3, when we got the burning bush story. This is God introducing God's self to Moses. And Moses says, "What's your name?" And God responds, Ehyeh Asher Ehyeh. Perhaps the Popeye line, I will be what I will be. Or I am, I was, I will be. It's a future tense expression, but it plays into this idea of God in that verbal idea. That this really is the place to develop that concept of God in that verbal idea. Number 6, L, is the lowercase God. So if we think of in English how we write our proper pronouns, like my name, M, uppercase M for Michael. But if I was to write dad, I'm a father to a 10-year-old, I would write lowercase d. L might be considered the lowercase everyday pronoun title, like God as title. L is also an ancient Canaanite reference to gods, not just the God of Israel, but any God is called an L. That term El also has a plural form, and it's Elohim. So in the Hebrew Bible, we have 2 names of God. One is Adonai, Yud He Vav He name, and the other is Elohim. This is primarily the Genesis name. And this is, as we can see, a plural. In Hebrew, the I am suffix at the end of words creates a plural noun, which is radical, right? God as a plural noun, what the heck does that mean? And we can see that, that really only exists for the book of Genesis and in a few places after, but primarily that Genesis concept competes with that first Yud Hey Vav Hey throughout the book. And therefore, we get this whole documentary hypothesis that the God character can be looked at as two different God characters, the Elohim God and the Yud Hey Vav Hey God. And that when we look at the Hebrew Bible, we can tease out two different sets of texts. One that refers to God as Elohim, one that refers to God as Yud Hey Vav Hey. And then we can begin to see that if we separated all those verses out, the text still makes sense. There's a beginning, a middle, and an end. And that we had, in redacting these texts, combined the two sets of texts together. This idea is called the documentary hypothesis. We went over this in week 2 when we went over the Hebrew Bible. But we see most of this Elohim idea in the Genesis text. Okay. Elyon is the supreme one. Shaddai is also a Genesis name. It means both almighty and breasts. It is God as the God of nature. I like to think of it that the nourishing God. El Shaddai is the term in Genesis, the God of who's almighty, or the God of breasts. Shalom, peace. We're desperately praying for peace in the Ukraine today. And this idea that peace is so sacred, so essential to human existence, that the name peace should also be the name of God.
Do people use that?
Some, yeah, some. Shekhinah, this is a term that develops with the rabbis, number 11. And this is God as the indwelling presence that we might sense during prayer. When we feel that God is close, especially close to the brokenhearted, as we say in Psalms, we might say that that sense of God being close to us might be what the mystics would call the Shekhinah, the lowest level of God's godness to our human form, and something that we could sense. What we can notice from the Hebrew term is it's got an ah ending, which means it's a feminine form. This is God as woman, God as womb. And we don't often think of God as womb, but in the Kabbalah, the mystical ideas of God, there is a masculine element, which is Adonai and the Shekhinah. And so we say on Shabbat, God's masculine sense joins God's feminine sense, and they make love on Shabbat. And that is the Lecha Dodi song that we welcome in Shabbat with, the bride being greeted by her groom and the wedding witnesses. Number 12 is a biblical form. This is called Yah. The Yud and Hey together create this Hebrew term Yah. And we know this one in English from Hallelujah. Hallelujah is we all praise Yah, the ancient biblical form of God. This is without the Vav He ending. It's considered a more ancient form of that name. After that, we go to, let me scooch this back up, 13. Adonai Tzevaot is how this one is usually pronounced, the God of hosts. I want to say this is God, the host of the angelic beings. It's also the God of war. This is God as a warrior who leads Israel out of Egypt. This is another term of God. Adir, number 14, the strong one, who might kind of hang out with the Adonai Tzevaot. Adon Olam, this is the famous song that we sing at the end of some of our prayer services, and this is the master of the world. Atik Yomi, ancient one of days. Avinu Malkeinu, this is the famous prayer that we sing on the high holidays, the Jewish New Year, Rosh Hashanah, and our Yom Kippur. This is our Father, our King. And so for some of us, this song, when we sing this, there is a sense of really not only requesting God listen to our voice, to hear our prayers, but that God as Father, as parent figure can be somehow close to us. For some, it's a meaningful prayer, a meaningful phrase. Av HaRachaman, the merciful Father, Boreh, the creator. 20, Chei HaOlamim, life of all the worlds. This is one of my top 5, so to speak. I love this term. Echad, this was at the end of the Shema. It is both the number 1 and perhaps a name for God. If God is the oneness of the universe, then the name one might be God. And the mystics do develop this idea that when we say Echad, we have special intentionality about pronouncing that word as God, as that is God's self as well. That it's not just the name Adonai, but the term one with full intention can be a name for God.
It gets a little emphasis when you say it during the prayer.
Yeah, for sure. Ein Sof, this is the Kabbalistic God of infinity, the infinite one. This is the transcendent nature of God beyond all nature. And this, the Hebrew term Ein Sof means without end. So from this idea of God without end, we can actually come pretty close to that Buddhist idea of the concept of nothingness, no thingness without end. There's some similarities in both of those ideas. Okay. Elohei Avraham, Elohei Yitzhak, Elohei Yaakov. This is from our standing prayer, the Amidah. This is the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob. I often imagine myself invoking my great-grandparents when I'm saying this prayer. So it's kind of like the God of history, or the God of my history. El Hagibor, God, the strong one. Eloheinu, our God, and Emet, truth. And now we'll go into the second column. Ezra, I'm going to need you to scroll up on your screen a little bit. Perfect. We'd already, I guess Ein Sof was in there twice. That's my mistake. So we'll go to Eli, my God. When Moses and Miriam cross the Sea of Reeds and they leave Egypt and they sing the song of redemption, Az Yashem Oseh, the song of the sea, they use the term my God, Eli. And we know the famous song, Eli, Eli, about the Holocaust. Ro'eh Yisrael, the shepherd of Israel. Very loving, very comforting concept. HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the holy, blessed one, blessed be he. Kadosh Yisrael, the Holy One of Israel. Melech HaMelachim, the King of Kings. Makor or Hamakom, literally the place. A very popular name of God for the rabbis, God as place. Makor Chaim, the source of life. Magen Abraham, the shield of Abraham. Nishmat Kochai, the breath of all life. I will tip the scales a little bit. This is one of my favorites. When I am trying to communicate to my concept of God, this is the phrase I use in my prayers to invoke what I mean by God. And so I think Nishmat Kochai speaks deeply, both to me as a rabbi and as a meditation teacher. I find a lot of resonance for this. Rabbono Shel Olam, the master of the universe. Ruach HaOlam, the spirit of the world. Sur Yisrael, this is a fascinating one, the rock of Israel. The reason this one is fascinating, for all of you who are interested in Israel and Zionist ideas about Israel, when the state of Israel is formed in 1948, this is the form of the idea that they write about in the Declaration of Independence. God as Sur Yisrael, the rock of Israel. And we can imagine that this metaphor is different. It is eternal. It's not shifting. It's not changing. It just is the rock, the fixed thing. It's a fascinating metaphor. Hashem, as mentioned before, the name, and Yedid Nefesh, beloved of my soul. What I want to say about this last term is we often think about God in different ways. God as parent, as I mentioned, God as transcendent. We rarely think of God as lover. And this phrase, God as lover, the beloved of my soul, is also the name of one of the popular Shabbat prayers that we sing at the beginning of Shabbat, Yedid Nefesh. And so for some, especially the mystics, Yedid Nefesh has a certain resonance. Okay, this is the list. Ezra has sent around the link if you need to have this up on your computer. Ezra, I'm going to ask you now if you can create breakout rooms, and your task in your breakout rooms is to spend 5 minutes saying which terms resonate with you and why. You don't get a lot of time to explain yourself, but you'll each have a minute or two. So take some time and think about which ones A are you drawn to, or B, which ones are you adverse to? Two different ways to kind of come up with some things to chat about. And I will see everybody in about 5 minutes. Okay, so we'll start with the group here. And since we started on this side, we'll start over here. Alex, which of these terms are interesting or problematic for you?
I always go with, well, not always.
Chat to you, Aaron. I accidentally didn't press everyone.
No, that's okay. I was like, okay, that's great. That's the best news I've ever heard.
Very, very intellectually formed.
So what are your favorites?
Well, mine are, I'm going to jump right in there, I guess. Mine are the Elohim and Adonai, which is probably the only ones I know over and over and over again. I haven't heard anything about the other ones, so the other ones haven't grown on me, but I love Adonai and Elohim.
Interesting.
Mhm.
I liked number 5 a lot. I'm not even going to attempt to try and say it. After I learn how to say it correctly, that is a very nice one.
Ahie,
also-
Asher, Ahie is the
Yeah.
pronunciation there.
Okay, I have to practice that by myself for a little bit. But and I also like Shadeh and Shalom. And I also like the Breath of Life one. Those 4 to me encapsulate what I think of God is. So I like those.
I like Shalom. I definitely like
Easier for me. So much easier for me to kind of wrap my mind around. Mm.
Yes. Well, it seems to me that some of them are more anthropomorphic than others. I mean, those are
Yeah.
the ones I have more trouble with.
Right.
The ones like you're saying, more processed, or those are more appealing. I didn't know all of these. I mean, so.
Welcome back. Welcome back to the main room. I hope that was fun. I hope that was an engaging activity. I want to, I wish we could take an hour and just hear everyone's thoughts and deep insights about this. I want to repeat what I was sharing with my own breakout group, which was this language of metaphors. The Hebrew Bible and the Jewish prayer book is filled with metaphorical language. And we don't always remember that. We don't always think about why the poet or the writer of this text is using metaphors that either we love or we might not like much. And so the permission I want to give us is we can always invite in different metaphors if we think they're friendlier, if they're more enticing. And that some of the metaphors are inappropriate from a generational lens. Some of them might be inappropriate from a gendered lens. Some of them might be very inappropriate from a lens of transgender. Can we find God as they? In a new prayer book that just came out in Europe, I want to say during the pandemic, maybe right as the pandemic hit, the Masorti prayer book in England, when they translate God, they use they, them pronouns. That's phenomenal. Why is that phenomenal? Because in the first scene of Genesis 1, when God creates Adam, the first human, that first human is created in the image of God, and it is both a male and female. And all of a sudden, of course, we would use they, them pronouns. Of course, we would think about God in a more complex way than just a he or a she. So I don't want to do this to confuse you. I want to do this to invite folks in and say, there are many paths to thinking of these metaphors, and we can find ways that speak to our hearts and speak to our souls beyond the ones that upset us. David, quick one, go ahead.
Yeah, did we include in those God Yahweh? Because
Hey is Yahweh, David,
Okay.
thank you.
Yeah.
So when we think of Yahweh, that is putting consonants and vowels to the Yud Hey Vav Hey name and calling it Yahweh or Yehovah or something like that. We just don't know what the exact pronunciation is. And Jews do not verbalize that name. And so it's just not a name that is necessarily a Jewish version of that name. But that Yahweh name probably would be considered for the Yud Hey Vav Hey name, which was number one.
Thanks.
Amy, go ahead.
So the revelation here for me is this multiplicity of ideas about who or what God is that you're saying and the books are saying is reflected in Jewish thought is so interesting to me, because I go to church now with my husband and spend a lot of time in the Christian community of people of faith. And sometimes people say, so what do Jews think about this? What do Jews think about that? What do Jews think about God? Does God exist? And I'm often kind of at a loss as to what to say. And now I understand why.
Yeah. The way I often tell your story, Amy, is kind of like if you ever go to a Jewish delicatessen, the menu in a deli, it's like 25 pages long. That's kind of like if you go to, just think of the deli in Beechwood, right? It's a big menu, right? There's a lot of choices. The Jewish range of choices on God, very complex, very layered. And, if you want to have a range of names from a secular perspective, you've got that. If you need a feminine form, you've got that. If you need God as parent and dad, you've got that. And it's all and everything in between. There's a lot of shades of gray here, a lot of different choices. Len, quick one, then we'll move on.
Yeah, I hear you saying all this stuff about euphemisms, and I've heard all these terms. I've only been reading this stuff since I first learned to read, and I never thought of them as euphemisms. I always thought of them as just adjectives. Instead of saying the boy, the big boy. Instead of saying the girl, the tall, beautiful girl. And we're just adding things that are descriptive. I don't think of them as names of them. It's not beautiful.
Yeah.
It's not tall. Those aren't names.
So to play your game from there, I guess the question I would ask you is if you were writing a poem or writing a creative sentence about your experience of when God's been close to you, which adjectives from this list would you choose? And that might be a way to understand the exercise here, that we are actually inviting in adjectives that help us explain aspects of God's godness that make sense to us.
I think I just refer to Adonai and then my own terms, not any of the ones I saw on the list.
And that's fine too, right? If it's a poetic creative writing exercise, you could go up with your own and that'd be fine. What this all means is that we've got a wide variety of God ideas in Jewish thought. We were introduced to a few of them last week. We're going to go through a few more this week. And we are really just touching the surface of this idea that I've said a couple of times. Last week's session for me was a year-long class in rabbinical school. Today's session were 2 year-long classes in rabbinical school. Right? There's a lot of content that we're moving through, and we're just kind of hitting the highlights, which is kind of fun. But if you wanted to dive deep, the reason I asked you to buy this book is now when you're done, you can go back and go, oh, I want to read more about that Spinoza guy because he seems to be more like a process theology guy. He might be influential to Mordechai Kaplan or vice versa. I can understand Kaplan now because of Spinoza. There's relationships that we're going to begin pointing to from the medieval folks to the modern folks and then the contemporary folks. And then you can kind of get a sense, oh, so these guys are building on their teachers and their teachers were building on the teachers behind them. And all of a sudden there's kind of a fullness there, a complexity, a sense of ideas that are not just brand new, but they're developing in Jewish philosophy, Jewish thought over the past 1,000 years. We left off last week with the mystics in Tzfat. That was Isaac Luria. And we touched on Spinoza. That was as Spain has kicked the Jews out in 1492, and the Jews are on the run. They go to Amsterdam, they go to Portugal, they go to Turkey, they go to throughout Europe. They actually hop on Columbus's boat, and they part of the Jewish, the diaspora join Columbus out here. In fact, if we think in 1776, there were 4 synagogues in the United States. All 4 of those synagogues were Sephardi synagogues, meaning they were coming from Jews of Spain that had been part of different Spanish colonizing groups for the first 150 years of this country, from let's say 1650 to 1800. That first wave of Jews in America were Spanish. At that time in 1776, that's like a nice time frame to think about. That's kind of like the edge of modernity, when modern life is beginning to take root both in the United States and in France, right? The United States gives Judaism a level of citizenship for the first time. Jews could be equal citizens in this country with the signing of the Declaration of Independence. George Washington writes a letter to the Jews of Virginia, welcoming them in as full citizens. That was brand new. The only other country that did that for Jews was France. About the same time, 1792, Napoleon does the same thing and gives all Jews in France emancipation. They don't have to fear for their lives any longer. So in 1792, for the first time on the globe, we've got 2 countries that aren't Jewish countries that give Jews citizenship rights. That's rather recent, right after 3,000 years of doing Jewish, actually almost 4,000. Citizenship only is granted in the last 250 years.
And you mentioned, what was it, last week, Spain, 8 years ago.
At this time in Eastern Europe, in 1750, there is a mystic that develops Isaac Luria's ideas of Jewish mysticism called the Kabbalah into what will become Hasidism or Hasidut in Eastern Europe. His name is the Baal Shem Tov. The Baal Shem Tov wants to democratize Jewish mysticism, to say this isn't just for the scholars, it's not only for the rabbis, it's for every Jew. If you come to synagogue on Shabbat and you utter your prayers with intentionality, you can partake in this process as well. And for the first time, Judaism is kind of becoming relevant and meaningful for each individual, not just for the elites, the learned, the scholars. This development of Hasidic mysticism is an amazing idea that will get picked up by 2 of our thinkers, first Martin Buber and then Heschel. So we'll circle back when we get to their 2 guys. The Baal Shem Tov never writes anything except for a couple letters. His students kind of sit at his table and write down some of his articles, some of his ideas, and they develop Hasidic thinking. What we don't realize here in the United States is by 1820, Hasidic ideas had become so popular in Eastern Europe, the Ukraine, Russia, Poland, Austria, that by 1820, the majority of Jews in Eastern Europe were considered Hasidic. That's wild. Why don't we know about that? Oh, 90% of them died in the Holocaust. Oh my gosh. What a tragedy. Think about that. 90% of the Hasidic community do not survive the Holocaust. At the time of the Holocaust, 1/3 of all Jews in the world died. That's terrible enough, right? But to imagine that not 1/3 of you die, but that 90% of your community die because of your deep belief that God will save you because you've been doing the right thing. It's a devastating, devastating loss. And it's only in the last 20, 30 years that we've begun to understand the beauty and complexity of that community, both before the Holocaust and how they're trying to understand it after the Holocaust. I want to kind of move on from the Hasidic community in 1820 to what's going on in Germany at that time. In 1820 in Germany, the Enlightenment is going on. Jews in Europe are going to university for the first time. Remember I said in Spain in the 1200s, Jews were going to university. It takes to the 1800s for Jews to go to university in Germany and France and in England. But they begin going, and this Enlightenment in Hebrew, the Haskalah, is a way to think about that the German Jews in the early 1800s were university educated and they're middle class. These German Jews also developed Reform Judaism, and they will take this hotbed idea of Judaism having its own reform movement, like what Martin Luther does with the Christian church, a reformation on the tradition, and they will bring it into Judaism. Now, what happens when the German Jews come to the United States, they set up shop here in Cleveland and elsewhere, is they will go crazy with this creative idea, and they'll toss out Hebrew, they'll toss out the head coverings, they'll toss out the prayer coverings, and they will Americanize Judaism in this radical reshaping, in this reforming. And so this Enlightenment will also bring in very new and creative ideas about God. And at the same time, Enlightenment, as we know from other philosophical ideas, Nietzsche being the primary one, in the 1800s, we come up with Nietzsche's great idea that God is dead. Now, Nietzsche is arguing against a Catholic idea of God. So when I read that Nietzsche says God is dead, what I hear in that sentence is dogma is dead. The Catholic concept of dogma is no longer valuable for Nietzsche. But this idea that enlightened folks in the 1800s can kind of argue against traditional religious ideas and say, hey, we can do things without religion. We can do them in our universities. We can live a life that might be more secular and less traditional. I want to now pick us up to what will happen with Nietzsche's teachings is these existentialists will develop in Germany in the late 1800s, early 1900s. And the guy I'm going to focus us on first is Martin Buber, because every one of us should have some working knowledge of this guy and what he was doing. In Finding God, there's a lovely section on Buber. A couple things biographically that you need to know about Martin Buber. He's writing I and Thou, his amazing modern take on God in the early 1900s, before World War I. Develops it, 1905, 1910, somewhere in there. And he is arguing against secularity. He's arguing against all these God is dead folks who've left religion and want to become secular Jews or Christians. The other thing that Martin Buber does that's really important, two biographical notes. When he's 3 years old, his mom leaves. So imagine that for a moment. You're 3 years old, your mom packs her suitcases, leaves, and you don't see her again until you're 30 years old. You don't even know if she's alive or dead. I and Thou for Buber is an eternal quest for his mom. He's looking for a relationship because he's lost his primary relationship. It's a devastating biographical note that one of the things he is continuously seeking is a mom. Point two, when he's a young man in college, I want to say early 20s, he marries a Christian. And so his ideas of God need to make sense not only to him as a Jew, but they need to somehow make sense to his Christian wife. This has never happened before in Jewish thinking, where a Jewish person has married a non-Jewish person and wants to come up with a God idea that somehow speaks to both partners in a relationship. So both of these are really relevant to the ideas of Buber, because there's a fair criticism about Buber. Some Jews feel like Buber's ideas of God are too Christian. Okay, I can see that. It's about love, it's about relationship. Feels a little Christian. Get over it. I want to point out what Buber is doing, along with the other existentialists of his time, is looking for a different way to understand God. And he's going to understand God through the lens of relationships, not from him praying to God or God responding to him, but from the lens of how can he understand any relationship whatsoever. And so he develops this idea of there are two primary relationships. And this is all coming from I and thou. The first relationship is I-it. When you go to the bank and you take money out from the bank teller, you're using that bank teller as an it. You could care less about the bank teller, you just want your money. When you go to the grocery store, you're buying groceries, you give the clerk your money for the food, you leave. You have no real relationship with either the teller or the clerk. That's an I-it relationship. There's no holiness in that relationship. When you sit in front of a friend and you look that friend in the eyes and you see that person's fullness and you notice that you're fully present in that moment with your friend, almost in a Buddhist idea of a meditation that the relationship, the usness that's developing between you and the friend is so present, it's tangible. That for Buber is not an I-it relationship, it's I and thou. The two dialogue partners in that relationship are fully present to each other. And so therefore, I and thou may be Buber's ideal of what God could do, is in relationship, both in human relationship and a human-God relationship. Buber even speaks about this in the relationship with human and trees. When we see trees that we fall in love with, who give us shade and feed us, we can stand in full presence with the tree and have a relationship with the tree. The story I tell that kind of illustrates this Buber piece is from my own wedding to my wife. When I got married to my wife, I had done my spiritual preparation. She had done her spiritual preparation. And when we stood under the wedding canopy, something new appeared for us in our relationship together. That sense of usness, the space between us, was so rich, so present, we could touch it. That day, that moment, that experience of that holiness is what I turn to when I want to try and figure out what does Buber mean by I and thou. It's that sense of complete presence with the other, and that there's a third thing, a third ingredient in this. It's not just me and it's not just you. It's this space between us. And that, as an existentialist, is really what he's trying to develop, is a radical experience of being present with another human. So Buber develops this relational, dialogical idea of God that for modernity is like a complete new understanding of what God could be. If God was king in heaven, great, could be. For Buber would rather be in this I-thou space. He doesn't negate the king in heaven idea. He just says he wants to have a relationship with God in the here and now, which is great. Buber gets these sources from two groups of people. He gets it from the Hasidic mystics. He is a scholar of the Hasidic mystics and writes about their stories extensively. He's also a student of Buddhist mysticism and Buddhist meditation. And so we can see kind of influences of both. And as I mentioned earlier on, there is kind of a Christian loving piece here that there's very much about a loving relationship. This usness is based on an openness, a loving compassion for each other. Alongside Martin Buber, he's got his own playmate at the time. It's Franz Rosenzweig. We didn't have Rosenzweig to read about, but you should know that Buber and Rosenzweig are contemporaries who are writing about existentialism from a Jewish lens together. And at another time, we can develop Rosenzweig's approach to this dialogical idea. For Rosenzweig, he doesn't go with I, thou. He says, that's nice, Martin. I like that I, thou stuff. Buber would say, when you're in an I, thou relationship, the obligation is mutual. You bring you, I bring me, and that's a mutual relationship. Rosenzweig wants to say, no, when I am in a completely present relationship with another, I'm there to serve the other. If I really want to be present with the other, I have to serve the other. I have to take care of their needs. I have to be not only present with their questions and their conversation, but I have to be open to what they need in that relationship. And I want to think about this Rosenzweig piece from the lens of when my son was born. I caught my son when he came out, and when he was born and in my hands, I developed this relationship that was much more in that I will serve you. You just tell me what you want, and I will be there because I'm your dad. That's what dads do. Two different levels of relationship. One mutual, Buber, Rosenzweig, hierarchical. One taking care of the other or serving the needs of the other. Now, there's arguments that will go on forever about which one's primary, secondary. I want to say that we go through different ways of understanding our relationships in both places. The student that comes in to study with these two guys is Abraham Joshua Heschel. Heschel is a younger man than both Buber and Rosenzweig. So if they're writing in post-World War I Germany in 1924, Heschel is at that time a very young teenager. He comes to Berlin, I want to say in the late 20s, maybe the early 30s. Heschel is born into a Hasidic family in Warsaw, Poland, from a long lineage all the way back to the Baal Shem Tov. His family is from that original family, and they have been rabbis, not just rabbis, Hasidic ultra-Orthodox rabbis for 100 years. And Heschel is the first guy to kind of leave that community and want to not just have the Jewish learning, but the secular learning as well. So he's going to be intersecting this modernity piece from the experience of being not just a scholar of Jewish wisdom, but a scholar of sciences and university knowledge. He's considered an Elui, and Elui is a genius. He memorized everything very early on as a kid. He didn't have to go back and reread it. Whatever he read, he memorized. He had that kind of memory. Heschel is sitting at the foot of Buber and Rosenzweig, and he comes up with a third idea about dialogue. And his is more traditional because he's from a more traditional place. And his is more mystical because he's more of a mystic. And what he will say is, Buber, I like your idea of the mutuality. Rosenzweig, I like this idea that there's hierarchy. I'm going to focus in on one element of the relationship. I'm not going to focus in on me. I'm going to focus in on the you, the thou, God. And I'm going to focus in on how God is waiting to be in relationship to us. Oh, we don't spend any time there. Heschel wants to spend a lot of time in that end of that equation. Heschel writes books about man in search of God. And so right in that relational piece, he wants to focus in on how have we up and left the relationship? And is God waiting for us to be back in relationship? Fascinating, like relationship to the existential piece that Buber and Rosenzweig wrote about. But Heschel, in essence, isn't an existentialist. He's really a mystic who's coming in. He's using existential ideas to develop some of his thinking. But Heschel will do a couple things that are important for us to know historically. In the 30s, he's writing his doctoral dissertation in Berlin. And then, as we know, Berlin gets very unsafe for Jews. And in 1938, as the last of the Jewish scholars are realizing the doors are closing and they're not going to get out, a group of American scholars sends out a wish list for all the geniuses that they need to save before the Nazis close the doors. Heschel, Albert Einstein, a few others are on that list. They sneak out because this is sent over in 38 and 39 before the doors close. And Heschel is brought to the United States. He concludes his PhD research on the Book of Prophets and their ecstatic ideas and how we could rethink about prophetic literature from a modern lens. It's a fascinating idea. he comes to the United States and he writes endlessly about this relationship of God searching for man and man seemingly leaving the relationship. And he does it from an American lens. He becomes a student of American culture as well. And the text I want to focus on for a second is from the Sabbath, Shabbat. He writes a small book, I want to say in the late 50s, early 60s, about the Jewish Sabbath. And he creates a word picture that's fascinating. The Jewish Sabbath goes for 25 hours, from Friday afternoon at sundown to Saturday evening with the sunset. During that 25 hours, Jews are not permitted to do any work, and they're trying to leave their work week and enter into the day of rest. And as we talked about in our Sabbath discussion a couple of weeks ago, this perspective on the Sabbath can feel both constraining, all the things you're not permitted to do, and once you do them, it can be inviting. So what Heschel wants to do is have us think completely different about the concept of the Sabbath. For Heschel, he creates in the first chapter of his book the concept of a palace in time. For Heschel, Shabbat is a palace in time. He gets to visit this palace in time on Friday afternoon when he lets go of the week. And in this palace in time, he can be a completely different person than he can be the other 6 days of the week. He can relax because he has the time to relax. And as I mentioned in our Shabbat class a couple weeks ago, it's an invitation almost to a meditation retreat. It's a chance to let go of your to-do list and just be. Instead of going 24/7, you can go 24/6. So for Heschel, this construct of a palace in time means that once he can leave the constraints of the world of time, he can spend 25 hours in a timeless place. What the rabbis call a taste of heaven. So when the rabbis of the Talmud want to understand a heavenly concept, they talk about Shabbat. When you engage fully with Shabbat and you can be wholly in Shabbat with your community, your prayers, your study, your sense of self, your sense of family, that's a taste of the world to come. That's as close as Jews get to describing heaven, is this palace in time, this world to come. Okay. So we've talked a little bit about Buber, a little bit about Heschel. From what both start out as German realms, and then Heschel comes to this country. When Heschel comes to this country, he's first planted here in Ohio. He starts off at HUC in Cincinnati for a few years in the late 40s. It's not a good fit. They're a bunch of rationalists. He's a mystic. He, after 3 or 4 years there, he's offered a job at the Jewish Theological Seminary in New York, in Manhattan, which is the focus for conservative Judaism, this middle of the road place is trying to understand modernity and tradition at the same time and do both, just like Heschel. And he becomes this esteemed scholar and author at the Jewish Theological Society. He works there for the next 20 years. At JTS, there's another scholar that's already been there for a while. His name is Mordechai Kaplan. And Kaplan has a completely different understanding about American Judaism and God than both Heschel and Buber. He doesn't apologize for them. He just disagrees vehemently with both and writes vehemently about his disagreement, because Kaplan's an Orthodox rabbi who's born in Europe in not the Hasidic community, but is what is called the Nagdim community. He's a Litva. He's used to saying no to the mystics. He doesn't like mysticism. He considers all mysticism silly, superstition. Let's get rid of the superstition. Let's just dump all this superstitious crap. We're in America now. And in America, we're going to focus in on democracy, not superstition. And so Kaplan comes to America as a young Orthodox rabbi when he's 20 years old. He spends his first 10 years here during World War I, living in New York, developing his ideas, and very quickly he becomes a student of John Dewey. John Dewey is an American sociologist who's developing fascinating ideas about how America becomes an opportunity for everyone. And that happens when you develop a community. When you can be in communal spaces, you can develop these thoughts. So for Kaplan, he's going to look at American democracy as an inspiration for his Jewish ideas. And he falls in love with the concept of Jewish community as this heartbeat of all of Jewish practice. In 1922, Kaplan does something radical. We're going to be celebrating the 100th anniversary of this radical idea in about 2 weeks. In 1920, women get the right to vote in America. He is so impressed with this moment in time, with American democracy giving women the right to vote. He wants to take this and apply it to American Judaism. And so in 1922, his eldest daughter, turns 13. And he realizes that in traditional Judaism, girls are not permitted to have a bar mitzvah. They never had been. And he wants to hold the same dream for the right to vote and say, why can't we give this to my 13-year-old daughter? Can she have a bat mitzvah? And his daughter, Judith, is the first American Jew in the history of American Judaism to have a bat mitzvah. Happened 100 years ago. So March 18th, 1922 will be the 100th anniversary of that moment. Radical rethinking about how Judaism needs to develop itself and come into modernity, and to reinvent itself for the sake of women's equality. Phenomenal gesture. He's a creative thinker. He comes up with the idea of the shul with the pool. He knows in the 1920s, Jews are not permitted to go to the YMCA. The Young Men's Christians Association isn't for Jews. He shrugs his shoulders and says, so why don't we just develop a place for Jews to go? That's the birth of the JCCs.
Not the YMHA.
Yeah, the YMHA is part of that, but they're both out of that same laboratory to say, can we have a place for Jews to do Jewish, where they can go swimming and not be kicked out of the pool because they're Jewish? Another radical idea in the 20s in New York. His third radical idea in the 20s is Jewish summer camping. We know in the last 100 years how amazing Jewish summer camping has been. So he's creating one thing after another. His book, big book, to describe all this is called Judaism as a Civilization. It's a phenomenal book, and we're going to talk about that title as a way of understanding Kaplan. In that book, he calls not only Judaism as a civilization, but Judaism as an evolving religious civilization. Kaplan is interested in Judaism's history, but he's not married to the tradition the way that Heschel is. He wants to move beyond the traditional norms and welcome in modernity and welcome in new ideas. And his famous line about the past is that the past has a vote, it doesn't have a veto. And the way I want to think about this is in every classroom that I teach, in every service I lead, in an empty chair, I sit my great-grandfather who grew up in 1889 in Russia, came to this country when he was 12 years old. He left the Tsar's army because he would have had to serve for 25 years. And he gets on a train, instead of heading to Moscow, he heads west and leaves Russia. His grandfather had already come to Boston before him. He was a Talmud scholar, paid for his passage. My great-grandfather loved Shabbat. He had Shabbat dinner for his children and his grandchildren. He had two girls, his two girls had two girls. I was the first boy in 3 generations. he wanted another man to talk to. So when I was 3 years old, he sat me at the head of the table next to him so he could have a boy to talk with. And I fell in love with Shabbat. I also fell in love with his approach to Jewish prayer. He shuckled, he swayed when he prayed, and I shuckle, I sway when I pray. And that way of enlivening my prayer is deeply valuable. So I have a deep love and respect for my Zaidi, but my Zaidi never met a woman rabbi. He died in 1980. And so when I turn to my Zaidi in that empty chair, I say, Zaidi, what do you think about my wife, the rabbi? He'd say, nah, I don't go with women rabbis. That's the past has a vote. It doesn't have a veto. He can tell me he doesn't like women rabbis because he never met one. But I don't have to hear his criticism of my Judaism as anything more than a vote and not a veto. But this is living that in a very large way. To have a relationship with the past and to celebrate that relationship, and at the same time to say, I'm living at a time that is so radically different than what he would have known that I've got to find new creative ways to do this. He never met Zoom. He never met a computer, right? He wouldn't know what to do with this stuff. But I deeply love my Zaidi, and I have a picture up in my office where I can look at him from our. So that's Kaplan. That's the Kaplanian piece. Now I want to hang on to your questions. We'll get to them. I want to say one more thing about Kaplan and God, because as I whet your appetite earlier on with Amy's question, Kaplan has a rethinking about God that is wild. It's almost like Spinoza, this idea that if we go out and we fall in love with the natural world, the trees and the bushes and the sky, for Spinoza, that was God, that pantheism. Kaplan has a sense of that naturalistic idea of God, but he wants to locate that in a relational place that's a little bit different than Buber and Heschel. He wants to relate to that up in the sanctuary when we come together as a community in prayer. And for Kaplan, God is all of our voices singing at the same time. When we are all singing with our focus and our community and we're trying to celebrate our joys, that's when Kaplan thinks God's present. And so that communal concept that when Jews do Jewish, God is somehow part of that communal process is a very different idea. What I want to give as an example of how different that is the term salvation. When Christians use that term salvation, it means a heavenly reward. You're going to be saved of all your sinful behavior. When Kaplan uses the term salvation, salvation is being in community. When you can lose your sense of aloneness and separateness in a circle of other people and feel like you're connected to the group, and we can sing together, that moment of losing yourself in the group song is for Kaplan salvation itself. A complete rethinking of some of these amazing ideas. And as Amy pointed out, that's radical. He's not well liked among the Orthodox community. He's kicked out as an Orthodox rabbi. He becomes the very first Reconstructionist rabbi. I studied at the Reconstructionist College. And so I kind of come as a student of Kaplan and Kaplan's thoughts. And I want to say that he is probably the first Jewish process theologian. He's the guy who's thinking of God as a process. And so one of the best explanations of Mordechai Kaplan comes from one of his students, Harold Schulweis, who is out in Los Angeles. And Schulweis comes up with the idea of not only God as a verb, which I mentioned earlier, but God as the predicate in the sentence, not the noun. So Schulweis has a predicate theology, very different than the idea of God as the direct object, but God as the verb or the predicate in the sentence is how Schulweis and Kaplan want to reconceive of God as part of this experiential piece, but the experience not just of the individual, but of the communal. Very much a democratic piece, right? that the democratic norms in a Reconstructionist community are so powerful that the community should vote on whether we keep the rabbi by a simple democratic, if the majority want the rabbi, we keep the rabbi. They're very, very different model. The whole idea of rabbi as decision maker in a communal Reconstructionist setting is not to be the arbiter, the decider, like most traditional rabbis. It's not to even empower the individual, like most Reform rabbis. It's to empower the community to make communal decisions, which is a fascinating refocusing on the hub of the wheel for Reconstructionists is always about community. That's always what we're focusing on. And as Mason and others can say, like when I'm at Hillel, it's always about what the community needs, rarely about what I want, but more like what do the students at Kent State feel like they might need or want when we're celebrating this holiday. Okay, that's a little bit on Mordechai Kaplan. And I'm running low on time. So what I want to do is kind of pause myself. I gave you kind of a good taste of our three voices, Buber, Kaplan, Heschel. What we didn't talk about is the Holocaust and how the Holocaust changes American Jewish thinking completely. That after the Holocaust, any idea of God as Santa Claus is dead. And I need you to take that in. For many people who have a personal theology that if you do the good stuff, the right things, Santa Claus will reward you with all of your nice presents. That might be a nice Christian idea of God. But for Jews who survived the Holocaust, it's no longer a worthwhile concept. That childlike idea of God is no longer going to save our lives. And as we witnessed 90% of the Hasidic community dying in the Holocaust because they were so obedient to that, we can't ever get close to letting that happen again. So American Jews since 1945 have had to make sense of not only God in their lives today, but God in their lives after the destruction of the Holocaust. What do we do with evil? Because humanity has become so evil so frequently that if we don't understand that, talking about God might be a waste of time. We'll go deeper into that with Elie Wiesel, and when we study in a couple of weeks, we'll look at Elie Wiesel and the Holocaust. All right, come back. I'm going to talk a little bit about the homework, and then we'll have about 10 minutes for questions. I'm sorry, we're gonna go a little bit later. So if you need to duck out at 5:30, no judgment whatsoever. Next week, we're going to talk about prayer. And we're going to have two sessions on prayer, one on the structure, the what, when, how of prayer. And then in week 2, the following week, we'll do the why, some of the art of prayer stuff. In the readings, in Book of Life, there's a great Path of Prayer chapter. It's on page 176. That's going to be our primary reading. In Essential Judaism, the first chapter, the first 35, 40 pages on prayer, those are both great readings. I'll send an email reminder tonight with the YouTube link with the video. Okay, I'm going to now ask for questions first about Kaplan, Heschel, and Buber, and then we'll open it up to broader God questions. So who's got questions about Kaplan, Heschel, and Buber? Len, get us started.
On Heschel, I'm a little surprised. I find with him, like all the other people that I've just been reading about, there are so many internal contradictions that don't make sense to me. Yeah. He's Hasidic, he's mystical, but he's also well known for radical astonishment, which I find all the way on the other end.
Yeah. So let me, the concept of radical amazement is a beautiful one. What he comes to understand about Americans, and American Jews specifically, is American Jews spend all of their time in Judaism up in a synagogue, and they don't go out to the ocean and watch the sunset and go, oh my God, that was a miracle. And all of us who have been out in nature, whether we're hiking or visiting our favorite places, we can encounter the awe of being in nature. For Heschel, he wants to say American Jews, and by extension, Americans in general, must go out in nature and reclaim awe. The reason he wants to do this is because the Hebrew term awe, yirah, is often translated as fear. And he wants you to dive and grapple with that term and say, it is fear of God, it's also awe of God. And he wants you to have some awe in your life.
Awe is so different from fear.
Very different. And if we don't engage it, we might not realize that awe can be part of how we connect Jewishly as well. That when I am at a mountaintop or at a beach and I'm offering up my prayers, it feels very different than when I'm upstairs offering up my prayers. Somehow the prayers at a beachfront feel more alive. They feel like they're traveling a shorter distance, or they are speaking more directly from my experience of the moment. There's a radical amazement is a phenomenal concept, and he really develops that as a beautiful heart of what his focus is. Other comments, questions about Kaplan, Heschel, and Buber? PJ, go ahead.
It was interesting to me that all three of them have a topic in here called the problem of evil.
Yeah.
And I just wondered if you wanted to comment on that, or is that something you'll take up when we discuss Holocaust or?
So let me just, that's a great thought. Let's just kind of like tap on that for a minute, PJ, because it's a really important one for how we understand Buber. Buber dies in 1939. He never encountered the Holocaust. So he didn't deal with like, what do you do with the Nazis? It just wasn't part of his lived experience. Rosenzweig dies even a year earlier. He dies, I think, in 26 or 24. And so both of them experienced World War I and the horrors of World War I, but they don't encounter the anti-Semitism of the Holocaust in their lives. Heschel, as we see, is saved from that and grapples with the evil for the rest of his life, and ultimately comes down with a very important idea that he writes about later on in life, which is he meets Martin Luther King and he begins to march with Dr. King a lot, and they become good friends. And he, at the end of his life, begins to move from prayer to social justice being the focus of his work. And he even says that when he was marching with Dr. King, his feet were praying. Fascinating idea that doing the work of justice for this mystic was actually a form of prayer. And Kaplan is a Zionist. Heschel is a Zionist as well. Buber, all three were Zionists. But Kaplan survives the Holocaust and speaks to evil in a very different way, right? Because what he's going to think about is that communal response to the Holocaust, and what do we do with the baggage of the nightmares and the horrors of the crushing experiences. And so for Kaplan, it's less about blaming God and more about the witnessing that needs to happen so that it's never happened again. And therefore, for Kaplan, if he was here, he would say we should then engage in supporting Israel so that Jews who feel threatened can live in Israel where they might feel safe. I think that's part of what he would envision for the challenge of anti-Semitism. We'll certainly circle back a little bit on anti-Semitism when we get to the Holocaust in a couple of weeks. Any other Buber, Heschel, Kaplan questions? Amy, go ahead.
So we didn't talk very much about the reform movement, but when I first started coming to Temple Beth Shalom back in 1982 or 3, one of the things that bothered me about it was that there was practically no Hebrew, and I didn't have much background in Judaism, and it just I didn't get really why. I didn't get it very well. As we stand today at Temple Beth Shalom, seems like there's a lot more traditional aspects to worship and just structure and everything. Do you think that that's partly been an influence of the Reconstructionist movement?
It's a great comment, Amy. I want to say that it's a broader pendulum swing, that the reform movement in the late 1800s, early 1900s was so proactively rejecting all of traditional Judaism that they took off their prayer caps, they took off their prayer shawls, they stopped praying in Hebrew. They began to do what Christians do. They even prayed on Sundays instead of Saturday mornings. And so I think it became a pendulum swing that as Jews began to be accepted more and more in America, and they witnessed more and more acceptance, they realized that they could reclaim some traditional practices. So Amy, what you were describing in 1982 is what's called classical reform, where all of the classical practices look very much like what a Protestant church would look like. In the sense of very English-centered, very focused, on the what's going on here in this country, or maybe Israel. But in the last 40 years, there's been this huge pendulum shift of reclaiming spiritual practices, reclaiming Hebrew as a vehicle for our prayer life, reclaiming traditional concepts, primarily because classical reform stopped talking about God. And after the Holocaust, we needed people to talk about God. And so I think in the pendulum shift back towards tradition, Reform Judaism is opening itself up to more complex ideas about theology, more complex ideas about the tradition, and finding its own role in not just rejecting the tradition, but finding a way to empower the individual to think about, if they're studious. The Reform theologian is, I'm forgetting his name, it'll come back to me in a minute. He focuses in on being a serious Jew. If one is serious in their Judaism, if they're strong students in their Jewish life, if they look at all the educational opportunities, they can make educational choices about how their Judaism should be practiced. It's nice, and what we've seen in the past 30 years is American Judaism has created this very interesting shift towards spiritual life, and how the spiritual life and the needs of the spiritual life need to be attended to. And so I think what we've seen is a move beyond the serious Jew, right? That was the name of the Coen brothers movie, to this now focus in the last 30 years about the needs of our spiritual lives, and how are we thinking about our own spiritual sustenance and spiritual nourishment in our communities and in our spiritual lives.
Because like one of the things that I was thinking about though is when you talk about the central role of community in Reconstructionism and in Kaplan's ideology, it seems to me that's one of the central roles of acting the traditional ways, embracing the traditional ways. That's one of the big things that it does, is to build community and to define the community.
Yeah. And I want to say that all liberal Jews today, whether they're Reform, Conservative, Renewal, they're all functioning as students of Kaplan to some degree. Kaplan taught in the conservative movement for 30 years alongside Abraham Joshua Heschel. He was deeply influential in having American Jews think differently about their Jewish lives. And so I think the influence is just hard to measure, but I do think Reform Judaism's recent refocus on the needs of the community has been this kind of byproduct of what Kaplan was preaching 100 years ago. Okay, I want to move us now beyond Kaplan, Heschel, and Buber to the bigger concepts of God and God ideas back early on into the modern piece. If you have other questions about maybe the exercise we did at the beginning, the different names for God, or just other thoughts about these God ideas, now is time to kind of bring in some of that as well, if you've got thoughts. So we'll start with Alex here in the room.
That's sort of tangentially related to this. We, see these philosophers from Germany, Lithuania, all that, with the reformations going on in Germany, in the community and the reforming of the idea of God. It just made me think. There's also Marx, who is from a rabbinical family.
Yes.
And takes that
Yeah.
community very seriously, but is a sort of a radical rejection of God.
Yeah.
Where does that sort of?
It's a fun question to play out. If we think back to that opening idea last week, that there's three different paths, Jewish paths to God. One is through the mystical, one is through the rational, the scientific. The third one is through the secular. That Marx might be one of the secular voices alongside Mordechai Kaplan and Baruch Spinoza. Maybe Freud might be another, to think through Judaism from a cultural lens. And so we go back to that Kaplanian idea of Judaism as an evolving religious civilization. What Kaplan comes up with is Jewish peoplehood as its own essence of Judaism, that the peoplehood aspect of Judaism, the culture, the art, the food, the music, are all a part of our Jewish identities as well. And so like Marx and like Freud, who were cultural Jews, but not religious Jews, there might be some affinity there. Marx, in his rejection, also is going to spur a completely different set of thinking in America at the same time in 1910, 1920, because he will inspire the secular Jews who will become the activists for the labor movement. So secular Jews are moving to this country from 1880 and 1920 by the millions, like 2 million Jews moved to this country, fearing the anti-Semitism in Eastern Europe. And they become workers in different cities. And in the garment industry, primarily, they develop unions because they want the workers to have workers' rights. That's Marx's direct influence on American Judaism, more so than anything else. So the biggest thing I could imagine is this dedication to how Jews have fought for ethical norms like workers' rights. And to say, hey, it's one thing to work hard. It's another thing to lose your life because you're working hard. That's too far. Let's pull it up. And so there was, I want to say, for probably 30 years, from 1920 to 1950, a lot of Jews were identifying as either communist or socialist who were secular. Not the religious Jews, but I want to say the secular Jews. Some of them were identifying with either Judaism from a communist perspective or a socialist perspective. And I think as that happens in the 20s, 30s, and 40s, and Israel develops at the same time, what happens in Israel early on is this wave of socialist Jews who start relocating to Israel. Because Judaism in Israel in 1948 is a secular state based on a lot of socialist practices. So that communist strand, I don't want to say Marx specifically, but perhaps the socialist variations on that really get expressed in early Zionism, and we'll get back to that in a couple of weeks as well.
Gosh, I think it hit them in the backside in the early 50s.
Oh, for sure, for sure. Okay, great question on Marx's influence. Really love it. I'm looking for other questions. Amy, go ahead.
So I'm circling back to the question I asked at the beginning about whether this idea of God as a verb, as opposed to a noun implying being, implying like personhood, it is something that would be inconsistent with Orthodox ideas. And when you answered it the first time, you talked about some of Kaplan's ideas. But when I first heard you talk about that was in Torah study one morning, and it was such a revelatory idea to me. And I want to go back and ask the question again. Is that concept of God not as a person stand-in inconsistent with Orthodoxy?
I want to say Orthodox Jews, as a stereotype, kind of align themselves with one of two ideas about God. And I want to say the messianic character, the messianic dream. Some mystical, let's say ultra-Orthodox Jews will think of God as a messianic, will think of God from that mystical lens of God as personally engaged in their prayer life, answering their prayers, and will have a messianic dream that there will be a messianic character who will rebuild a third temple in Jerusalem. Some, I want to say, if that's the mystical concept of Orthodox Jews, the rational concept is more like Maimonides last week, more of God beyond description, God ineffable, indescribable, this transcendent God that you can't touch, you can't know, you just trust is there. And that both of them, I would say, are, let's say, traditional ideas about God that are still somewhat prevalent in the Orthodox community. This third avenue of God, this God as process, I want to say is pretty much absent in many Orthodox communities. And so if we think of the three people we talked about today, Kaplan is not influential in the Orthodox community, but both Buber and Heschel have had some influence. Heschel much more so than Buber, because Buber married a Christian wife. And so they reject Buber completely as someone who left the Jewish community. Right? The Orthodox Judaism is not open and receptive to interfaith marriage the way conservative Reform Reconstructionists are.
Is there such a thing as excommunication?
There used to be, cherem. Cherem is the term. Mordechai Kaplan was excommunicated from the Orthodox rabbis, and they burned his prayer books. I have one of his prayer books that he published in 1946. And they had a book burning in New York in 1946 of his first prayer books.
How enlightened.
Other questions, other comments? We have just a few minutes, but I want to give, if there's anything else, we can finish it off. Len, you get the last one tonight.
Yep. Okay, last week you said it was a little premature. Maybe it's appropriate now. You've mentioned Kabbalah, you've mentioned mysticism, and last week it was too soon when I said something. Well, first of all, I don't think it's egalitarian. I think there are secret practices. However, I brought up the fact that in the early 70s with the Guru Maharaji, there was all this stuff about levitation. At that time, I heard that Kabbalists could also do levitation. Anything to that?
I don't know.
Oh, well, obviously you haven't experienced it. Okay.
I've studied Kabbalah, I've studied mysticism. I have never had a teacher offer up practices about levitation. I have had other practices that they've told me were very scary and should never be done alone. But I have not had practices that even came close to describing themselves as being about levitation.
Any time for shokeling? You mentioned that term. And I know it's swaying while you pray.
Next week.
And, next week. I got it for you then.
Okay. Thank you for a fascinating conversation about God stuff. We will talk about prayer next week and how Jewish prayer is about self-discernment. So that's kind of to whet your appetite. I look forward to our conversation next week. This Saturday, we're going to be having a very special Torah study here at Temple Beth Shalom. It'll be on Zoom as well from 9:30 to 11. We're going to be reading the book of Esther. And the interesting thing about the book of Esther for Jews, it's a comedy. It's a funny book. In the Christian world, it is a tragedy. So we're going to read like why Jews read of this as a comedy. So the book of Esther is the text that we read at Purim. Purim is coming up in the middle of March. We'll be celebrating Purim a week later. So it's going to be kind of our introduction to Purim practices as well. So you're welcome to join us Saturday if you want at 9:30 for our study about Esther. Have a great week, everyone.
Rabbi, could you consider recording that Torah study session?
Yeah, it's a great idea. I could, thank you. It's a fine suggestion. And when I do some of these special ones like Esther, I think we could certainly record them. That'd be great.
Thank
we can
you.
even put them up on this channel. Yeah.
Yeah, because I know I'm not going to be able to be there, but I would like to hear that conversation.
Great. So Ezra, the question to you would be when I post that recording, if you could give me the instructions of how to put this as one of our 101 posts. That would be a great way to categorize.
Absolutely. Absolutely, yeah.
All right, everyone, take care. Have a great day.
So they're gonna rate the Book of Esther R.